The Green River murders is one of the most shocking and notorious serial murder cases in American history, still vivid in people's memories to this day. The Green River murders is the most terrifying and victim-heavy serial murder case in U.S. history. Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, killed 48 innocent women in the areas around Seattle and Tacoma in Washington. The police confirmed 48 victims, but during police interrogation, the Green River Killer voluntarily confessed to killing at least 71 innocent women. So, why did Gary Ridgway brutally murder at least 48 innocent women? What drove him to commit such heinous crimes? How were his crimes exposed to the world? In the end, how was he captured? Gary Ridgway's monstrous crimes were eventually exposed to the world, shocking the entire United States and eventually being solved by the police. It all started with a fishing enthusiast's discovery of the remains of two female victims at the bottom of the Green River. On August 15, 1982, a fishing enthusiast named Robert Eastworth, as usual, took his fishing gear and set off along the Green River in his rubber boat towards the outskirts of Seattle. Along the way, Robert enjoyed the scenery while paddling, feeling very relaxed and comfortable. When he paddled to the middle of the river, Robert looked at the clear river bottom, looking around to see where there were schools of fish. Suddenly, Robert found a girl with wide-open eyes standing in the crevice of a large stone on the clear river bottom. At first, Robert did not think that the body caught in the stone crevice was a female corpse, but thought it was just a female model prop. People always have an insatiable curiosity. Even if they think it's just a model prop, they still want to take a look and verify whether their idea is correct. Robert, who had made up his mind to verify, decisively picked up a wooden stick on the rubber boat and then extended the stick into the water and poked what he thought was a model prop. In order to extend the wooden stick into the water and try to touch the so-called model prop, Robert kept pressing his center of gravity towards one place, which caused the small rubber boat to lose balance and capsize directly. Robert fell into the water, and coincidentally, the position where Robert fell into the water happened to be next to the girl's remains. We all know that when people suddenly fall into the water, whether they can swim or not, their hands and feet will swing wildly at that moment. Caught off guard, Robert was tossed into the water by the capsized rubber boat, and in that instant his hands and feet flailed wildly. This flailing didn't seem significant, but it sent a jolt of fear through Robert in an instant. Because his wildly swinging hand touched the girl's remains, a distinct sensation that only a human body could produce was transmitted from Robert's hand to his brain. At that moment, Robert panicked, and he now realized that this was not a female model prop, but the genuine remains of a girl. What frightened Robert even more was that when he calmed down slightly and took a closer look, he suddenly discovered another half-naked white girl's remains standing in the crevice of a stone just half a meter away from the first girl's remains. At this point, Robert, who was extremely terrified, no longer cared about his rubber boat and swam frantically to the shore. After reaching the shore, without a second thought, Robert ran directly in the direction of the police station. Upon arriving at the police station, the still unsettled Robert stammered to the police about his experience at the bottom of the Green River. The discovery of two sets of girls' remains in the Green River is a major case regardless of the location. Upon receiving Robert's alarm, the local police wasted no time and immediately dispatched their best officers from the station, rushing towards the Green River where Robert had found the remains. Upon arriving at the scene, the American police promptly cordoned off the area, retrieved the two female corpses from the river, and based on their previous investigative experience, determined that the murderer was highly likely to use this location as a dumping site, and there were likely other victims' remains nearby. Therefore, they mobilized additional police to expand the search radius and conducted a thorough search around the Green River. As a result, they indeed found another girl's remains in the grass on the riverbank 300 meters away from the two victims. Later, through police investigation, it was determined that this victim was a 16-year-old girl named Opal Mills. When she was discovered, Opal was lying face down with a blue pair of pants wrapped around her neck, her upper body bare, and there were obvious bruises on her arms and thighs, consistent with being beaten. After a preliminary autopsy by the forensic doctor, the police初步推断 that she had been strangled to death. Forensic examinations of the other two victims found in the river revealed that they too had been strangled to death, and their estimated time of death was approximately 1 week prior. What astonished the police was that the bodies had been in the river for no more than 2 days, indicating that the killer likely kept the remains of the two victims at home for at least 5 or 6 days after their deaths. The thought of having the remains of two victims at home for such an extended period is truly terrifying, and the fact that the killer remained unfazed suggests the extent of his cruelty and callousness. All three victims were strangled to death, which immediately escalated the tension among the Seattle police working on the case. At this time, an officer recalled that just a few days earlier, a woman's body had been reported found on a submerged log by the Green River, and the autopsy had also revealed that she had been strangled to death and was a young girl. All four victims were young girls who had been strangled to death. The uniformity in the victims and the modus operandi suggested that this was likely a significant serial murder case. There could potentially be undiscovered victims, or there might be more victims in the future. At this point, the Seattle police had only one option: to solve the case promptly, identify the deranged murderer, and prevent any further innocent casualties. However, before the Seattle police could make any headway in finding the killer, within just 6 months, an additional 6 bodies of young girls were discovered near the Green River. For a period, fear and terror gripped Seattle and its neighboring cities. Young women were too afraid to venture out alone, the streets became deserted, and the pressure on the Seattle police mounted with each passing day. Since the bodies of the 10 victims were found in the vicinity of the Green River, the police designated the series of murders as the Green River Murders, and the unidentified killer was referred to as the Green River Killer in the police records. With 10 young girls killed within a span of 6 months, the Seattle police could no longer remain composed and decided to form a task force, mobilizing their best officers and allocating all available manpower and resources to solve the case as quickly as possible. However, shortly after the establishment of the task force, 3 more girls under the age of 19 were reported missing, one of whom was 8 months pregnant, while the other 2 were only 16 years old. Despite the Seattle police's best efforts to search for the missing girls, there was no news for several days, indicating that they had likely been killed, which was later confirmed by the investigation. Subsequently, whether it was the killer's deliberate provocation or the incompetence of the Seattle police, as the police assured the public that they would solve the case promptly and bring the killer to justice, more victims continued to surface one after another. By April 1983, just 8 months had elapsed, and another 14 young girls from Seattle had disappeared, all ranging in age from 14 to 23. For the Seattle police, this was a blatant act of provocation from the killer. The escalating number of missing girls seemed like a taunt directed at their incompetence. In the face of such provocation, every officer in the Seattle Police Department was determined to find the culprit, vowing to work around the clock if necessary. Subsequently, every officer in the Seattle Police Department was mobilized, scouring every nook and cranny of Seattle for anyone who might have witnessed the killer. The investigation revealed that the 14 missing girls were mostly rebellious, often disappearing while waiting for a bus at a bus stop or engaging in illegal activities at cheap motels. The earlier victims or missing girls also shared a similar disposition. Based on this, the Seattle police theorized that the killer was likely a client who frequented these locations for illegal transactions. Therefore, the focus of the investigation shifted to strip clubs and bars in Seattle, where a comprehensive investigation was conducted on the patrons who regularly visited these establishments. In an attempt to apprehend the killer, the Seattle police even went so far as to have female officers pose as prostitutes to lure the culprit out, but to no avail. There were still no leads or clues. Just when the Seattle police were at their wits' end and unsure of what to do next, another murder was discovered locally. In May 1983, while a local resident was picking mushrooms in the forest, they stumbled upon the remains of a young girl in the grass. The victim was later identified as 21-year-old Carol Crisson. When her remains were found, they were covered with a yellow paper bag. Beneath the bag was a copy of the Seattle Times, which featured a report on the struggles faced by the Seattle police in relation to the Green River murders. The killer's intention in placing the newspaper on the remains was transparent. It was a blatant mockery of the Seattle police's incompetence. The killer's ridicule understandably enraged the Seattle police, but they were powerless as they had no leads regarding the killer and could only watch helplessly. Over the course of the following summer, 9 more young girls went missing in Seattle, and it was widely assumed that the majority of them were likely victims. With several girls disappearing each month, the local residents were gripped by unprecedented panic, fearing that disaster could strike them at any moment. The incompetence of the Seattle police also sparked unprecedented anger among the local residents. They took to the streets demanding the resignation of the Seattle police chief and criticizing the police's ineptitude. Faced with the public's outrage, the Seattle police were pushed to the brink and struggled to find a way to respond. They could only expand the scope of the investigation and continue a comprehensive search throughout Seattle. Finally, their efforts bore fruit, and a glimmer of hope emerged in the investigation into the Green River murders. In 1984, shortly after the remains of the 34th victim, Mary Malvar, were discovered, the Seattle police found a potential eyewitness during their inquiries. This witness was Mary's boyfriend, who told the police that the last time he saw Mary, she was getting into a pickup truck belonging to a local painter named Ridgeway. With this highly valuable clue, the Seattle police wasted no time and rushed to Ridgeway's home in their patrol car. Although Ridgway insisted that he did not know Mary, the police listed him as a major suspect in the Green River murders due to the eyewitness and brought him in for investigation. During the interrogation, Ridgway denied knowing Mary and claimed ignorance about everything else, refusing to admit any connection to the Green River murders. However, as the investigation continued, more and more clues pointed to Ridgway, such as his vehicle being spotted near the locations of the previous disappearances. The Seattle police employed various methods to find evidence of Ridgway's guilt, such as polygraph tests and collecting his hair and saliva for examination. However, due to the immaturity of polygraph and DNA testing technology at the time, they were unable to find the key evidence needed to charge him. In the end, they had no choice but to watch Ridgway leave the detention center. Unable to find evidence of Ridgway's guilt and with him passing the polygraph test, the Seattle police, though suspicious, could not confirm that he was the murderer. They shifted their focus to other suspects and continued to expand their search. By 1984, the number of victims in the Green River murders had exceeded 40, with no progress in the case. This not only caused panic among the people of Seattle, but also drew the attention of the entire country. the FBI stepped in, assembling a task force of more than 10 experienced agents to focus on solving the Green River murders and tracking down the Green River killer. At its peak, the task force included over 56 experienced agents and forensic experts who investigated 47,000 leads and examined 4,000 suspects, with 100 being considered high priority. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to determine even the general direction in which the killer lived. After 3 years with no progress, the task force was disbanded, leaving only the head of the task force, Reichert, to continue the investigation with a few officers. Time flew by, and in 2001, Reichert, the former head of the task force, had become the King County Police Chief, since the first victim of the Green River murders was discovered in 1982. Reichert had been investigating the case for 20 years. Despite many people advising him to give up, he never did and persisted in his tireless efforts. After taking office, Reichert immediately used his authority to reassemble a task force to solve the Green River murders, vowing to resign if the case remained unsolved that year. Thanks to the rapid development of technology, the task force now had access to much more advanced investigative equipment and testing techniques compared to the 1990s. With these advanced tools, Reichert quickly identified a suspect with a high probability of being the perpetrator, the painter Ridgeway. This time, Ridgeway was not as lucky as he was a decade ago. Back then, the immaturity of DNA technology had enabled him to evade capture. However, by this time, DNA technology was widely used in forensics. After submitting Ridgway's saliva sample, along with semen collected from 3 victims, to the Washington State Crime Laboratory for testing, the 20-year-old Green River murders case was finally solved. The laboratory confirmed that the DNA from Ridgway's saliva matched the semen found on the 3 victims, establishing his guilt as the killer. On September 30, 2001, the police officially arrested Ridgway. Subsequently, the Seattle prosecutor formally charged him with first-degree murder, which, according to local law, would carry the death penalty. However, in the American legal system, a conviction cannot be obtained without crucial evidence, even with eyewitnesses. Moreover, Ridgway continued to deny the murders, making it difficult for the prosecutor to obtain a conviction. Since the 3 victims were sex workers, Ridgway could argue that his DNA was left behind during illegal transactions with them. Apart from the DNA, there was no direct evidence linking Ridgway to the murders. In the eyes of the American court, which highly values evidence, DNA alone was not sufficient to prove that Ridgway was the Green River killer. Consequently, although he was arrested, the trial was at a standstill for 2 years due to Ridgway's refusal to plead guilty. Over the course of 2 years, the Seattle prosecutor's office spent millions of dollars on the case, with evidence and documents accumulating, and public opinion and victim family accusations exerting immense pressure on the prosecutor. Eventually, the prosecutor was compelled to reach a compromise with Ridgway. If he pleaded guilty, the death penalty would be waived in favor of life imprisonment. Seeing the opportunity to escape the death penalty for such heinous crimes, Ridgway promptly agreed to cooperate and admit his guilt. On November 5, 2003, the highly anticipated Green River murders trial commenced in the Seattle Superior Court. "I have killed so many women that I can't even provide an exact count of the victims," Ridgway, 54, confessed his heinous crimes in court. The prosecutor detailed the circumstances of the 48 female victims over the past 20 years, and Ridgway admitted to each of them, uttering, "I am guilty," 48 times. On December 18th, due to the agreement between the prosecutor and Ridgway to drop the death penalty in exchange for a guilty plea, The court recognized this agreement and ultimately sentenced Ridgway to 480 years in prison for 48 counts of murder, with no possibility of parole or sentence reduction, effectively a life sentence. Ridgway's arrest lifted the cloud of fear that had loomed over Seattle and the entire nation. As Judge Richard Jones stated when delivering the verdict, "Now is the time to put an end to the terror you have inflicted upon our society, and now is the time for our society to recover from the Green River murders and return to a peaceful existence." The Green River murders case generated significant panic in the United States at that time, resembling a nightmare. On February 18, 1949, Gary Ridgway was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, after the age of 11. He grew up with his mother in a town near the Pacific Highway in Seattle, essentially in a slum area, indicating that Gary Ridgway's family was not prosperous. As a youth, Ridgway had a low IQ, but at the age of 16, he nearly stabbed a 6-year-old boy to death in order to experience the sensation of killing. Due to his young age, he was not held criminally accountable at that time. 3 marriages gradually transformed him into a monster. In 1969, Gary Ridgway, at the age of 20, graduated from high school with no promising prospects. He joined the military and became a sailor. At that time, he married his wife, Barrows. However, shortly after their marriage, he was deployed to the front line. During his military service, he and his wife were often separated, and perhaps due to his strong youthful desires, he associated with some prostitutes and contracted a sexually transmitted disease. Later reports indicated that even so, he did not cease his association with prostitutes. When his wife learned of her husband's promiscuity, she divorced him. Thus, Gary Ridgway's first marriage lasted only 1 year. He then retired from the military and found a job as a truck painter. In addition to his strong sexual desires, Ridgway was an enthusiastic religious person who preached everywhere, attempting to control his second wife, Marcia, spiritually and demanding that she have sexual relations with him outdoors and in inappropriate places. Therefore, his second marriage also lasted only 7 years. During the 7 years of marriage, he had a son with his second wife, and his promiscuity did not change due to the divorce from his first marriage, as he continued to maintain a long-term relationship with prostitutes. In 1985, Judes became his third wife, who admired Gary Ridgway for his serious work, and Gary Ridgway also thought Judes was kind, gentle, and capable of handling household chores. The third marriage seemed like a perfect match, but behind this beauty lurked something extremely terrifying: the human heart. Gary Ridgway's heart was no longer so kind. Perhaps it was due to his beliefs, or perhaps it was because of his abnormal physical desires. At this point, Gary Ridgway had become a monster. Over 20 years, he killed 80 people, but at home he remained a good husband, and he was still an excellent painter at the Kenworth truck factory. Therefore, no one suspected this abnormal Green River killer, Gary Ridgway, who was nearly 50 years old. Another serial killer analyzed the psychology of the Green River killer and assisted the police in solving the case. Who was the Green River killer? In order to find him, the local police even consulted with Ted Bundy, another serial killer. Ted Bundy was a top student, majoring in law and psychology, so when the police approached him, he used his knowledge of psychology to offer his opinions. 1. After the killings, the Green River killer is very likely to bury the bodies in the area where they are currently found, which means that the number of bodies discovered is far less than the actual number of victims. Based on this judgment, the police excavated in the area where the bodies were found and indeed discovered more skeletons. 2. The Green River killer has abnormal sexual needs, so after killing and disposing of the bodies, he is very likely to revisit the site and have sexual relations with the bodies or others there. 3. The Green River Killer should live near the location where the bodies are disposed of. From the later revealed process, it can be said that Gary Ridgway cleverly evaded the police every time they had multiple interactions with him. In 1980, Gary Ridgway accidentally strangled a prostitute to death while having sex with her in a truck in the area where the bodies were dumped. The case was later filed, and Gary Ridgway was also questioned. He admitted to strangling the prostitute at that time, explaining that he did so in self-defense. Due to a lack of evidence, the case has been shelved. In 1982, Gary Ridgway was arrested and interrogated after being caught with a prostitute in a truck. This prostitute was later identified as one of the victims, Kelly McInnes. In 1983, the boyfriend of a missing prostitute testified that Gary Ridgway's truck was the last one his girlfriend got into before she disappeared. Gary Ridgway was interrogated that year. In 1984, Gary Ridgway was arrested for attempting to proposition an undercover female police officer posing as a prostitute. The purpose of this undercover female police officer was to investigate the Green River Killer. After his arrest, Gary Ridgway refused to admit that he was the killer, and the police even arranged a polygraph test for him, but Gary Ridgway passed the test. The American judicial system has a special system where the murderer can make a deal with the police, confessing to crimes that the police have not yet discovered in order to avoid the death penalty. After his arrest, in order to avoid the death penalty, Gary Ridgway agreed to cooperate with the investigation. He then continued to confess the details of each murder he committed, and also led the police to the places where the bodies were dumped. According to his confession, his favorite method of killing was to strangle the victims, and said that after killing them, he would have sex with them. He would use the deceased's underwear and rope. He would invite the victims to his home or the wilderness and then kill them. In his confession, he even killed a woman on the truck in front of his young son, and said that if his son realized that this was murder, he would brutally kill his son. As of July 2018, he is still serving his sentence in a prison in Washington state.